Yeah. So what transformational leadership means is leadership, because it requires you to deal with resistance, and it requires you to take people where they say they want to go and resist going.
Hmm.
It's going to require you to be transformed, and it's going to require them to be transformed.
Mm.
In other words, you won't be able to actually accomplish the thing you've set out to do unless you go through a very significant change. And I can't predict what that change is going to be. Now it becomes really hard. So it's not just a matter of using your skills or your expertise. It's literally having to learn as you go and having to deal with loss all the way along the way.
So a couple other terms, and then I want to pick apart some of the dive in a little bit deeper, because
Yeah.
I'm already loving this. Several other terms in the book that cause me to pause and digest, and for me, it basically is like a come back in a week kind of a thing after highlighting it and thinking through it. But relational congruence,
Mm-hmm.
technical competence, adaptive capacity, and on the map skill set. If you could walk us through, and I don't mind repeating those
Yeah.
a lot there, but walk us through these and the role that they play in transformational leadership.
Yeah. So, if we were sitting here in the room, I would be writing on the back of a napkin a Venn diagram of three circles. And because these are the three components that make up transformational leadership. So technical competence is literally your expertise. Most people who end up in leadership, it's because they were actually good at a task, right?
Mm-hmm.
So person with the highest sales ends up getting invited to be the sales manager or to lead the sales team. The person who is the professor who publishes the most gets invited to consider being the dean. In the church circles, we always say this, that whoever's the best preacher ends up being the person in charge of the whole church. Well, you end up thinking about that in a different way, because that technical competence now requires you to step into an area where most of us don't have much competence.
Mm-hmm.
Like not just because you're a good individual contributor doesn't mean you're going to be a good coach or a good team leader, right? Many star players never become great coaches. Relational congruence is what builds trust with people. So technical competence gives you credibility. You can do the job. Relational congruence means that you show up as the same person in every place you are. Doesn't mean you're perfect. It means you're
Mm-hmm.
congruent. Doesn't mean that you're all wise and all knowing. It means that you know yourself well enough and you are wise enough to know how to ask for help, to know how to build a team, how to invite people into a process, right? So what leaders need in order to take people, what I call off the map, into uncharted territory, into their own process of transformation, is it starts with needing to have enough technical competence where you have credibility, and enough relational congruence where they have trust, where people trust you're going to be the same person. An example I often use is if I wanted to do a backcountry backpacking trip off a trail into the wilderness, I'd want to go with an expert who understands the outdoors.
Mm-hmm.
But I'd also want to go with somebody who is not just a risk-taking thrill seeker. I want somebody who's also going to make sure I get home safe, who knows how to work with someone like me who is inexperienced. First is technical competence. The second is relational congruence. Adaptive capacity is the third circle. So once you have technical competence and relational congruence, once you have credibility and trust, now you actually have to learn a whole different way of taking the core values and adapting them to the changing environment without losing what is the most valuable to them. And that's what adaptive capacity is. It's that ability to know what is so important it will never change, and then be able to transform that or adapt that in such a way that it now becomes a value add or a strategic advantage or a missional inspiration or a purpose that is going to take you where you wouldn't otherwise go. And adaptive capacity is the capacity to learn as you go, to navigate loss, because all change is experienced as loss, and to deal with competing commitments and competing values.
And on the map, what is the on the map skill set?
Yeah, so on the map is your technical competence, right? So for Lewis and Clark, it was folks who understood how to run rivers and how to navigate and how to build a good military unit that had discipline and took care of each other and took care of all the supplies and made sure that there was food and that everybody was doing well, and you knew how to handle when there was injuries or when people got sick. Like, those are all the skills you have to have. So I always say the hard part about leadership today is you have to have on the map technical competence, the capacity to build trust, relational congruence, and you have to have this capacity to take these people and lead them into an environment where the very first step, they're going to look at you and say, hey, expert, you got us this far. What should we do next? And you're off the map when the very next thing you say is, I don't know.
Yeah.
And we're going to go anyway.
What happens at that moment? Like, should we be saying, I don't know, and we're going to go anyways?
That's the moment when you're in adaptive territory. And I think you could say there's a lot of stuff we do know. But just the Lewis and Clark story, here was a bunch of folks who were so gifted at running rivers that when they finally got to the Columbia River on the other side of the Rocky Mountains, they ran a set of rapids that all the Native Americans never, ever ran. Literally, there was this whole story in the Lewis and Clark story about how the tribes came out and stood on the edge of the banks of the river to watch these crazy white guys go down this river, expecting that their boats were going to blow apart and they'd be able to scavenge and gather up all the stuff that they would spill. And they made it through the river. Like, they were so good at running rivers. But when you get to the place where there's no river, like when you cross over the Lemhi Pass and you see the Rocky Mountains, and they're 300 miles long, where they're going to have 60 miles of hip deep snow, and you're a water guy and you built your canoes out of your own hands, literally they're asking you, what are you going to do next? And the only answer you have is, we're not sure. We're going to drop these canoes and we're going to see if we can go find someone to help us. They found the Shoshone, they traded for horses, and they kept going.
I love the history that you weave into all the different parts of your book and the story. I mean, I'm already have a high propensity for seeing what's around the corner and jumping in my kayak and trying to go on a little adventure. So I loved that. But one of the things that struck me was, and maybe you could talk a little bit more about the map that they were given versus what they saw. I know you've said it a couple of times, but they were given tools that were not enough, but everybody thought that they were enough, right?
Yeah. So one of the parts behind this, and this is actually completely relevant today in a lot of our culture, is there was a mental model that came out of Europe that was probably at that point 300 years old, like 300 years. And the mental model was basically this: the center of the world is Europe, and there's another place around the world that today we know as Asia. And in Europe, we're going to just get all the resources we possibly can out of that part of the world and bring them back to our part of the world. So we're going to everything we find, we're going to conquer. We're going to take the resources out of. We're going to take them, sell them, make us rich, make us powerful. So everybody in Europe had one worldview, which is find a water route, like one strategy, get a water route that will connect Asia to Europe. Well, when they start exploring and Columbus and a bunch of other folks stumble onto this big, massive landmass that we now know as America, they've spent the better part of 100 years just grumbling about trying to get through the darn thing.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it was just in the way. Well, 300 years later, when the United States of America is established in the East, all they're thinking of is, we could own the water route. If we own the trade route from Asia to Europe, we're going to grow up and be a wealthy nation. And they were vulnerable. And in 1805, when Meriwether Lewis and William Clark were going, it's because Jefferson wanted them to find a water route, because then they'd own the trade route. Well, here's the problem. All the maps assumed a water route. So there was actually even maps drawn that showed the Columbia River that people had explored from Oregon, from the Pacific Ocean side, and the Missouri River that people had explored, but they didn't know where it connected. So all they were trying to do is find the connection. They assumed those waters had to be connected. And what they discovered, of course, is that what all of the Native American people knew is that those rivers didn't connect. There actually were two different water sources, and that there was this massive mountain range in between them. And so they literally had a mental model of the world that was wrong, and maps that they were carrying with them that were wrong. And they discovered it and had to now decide what to do about it.
How do you correlate that to what you've seen in nonprofit work and in church world, business world? Because I'm thinking of a couple different examples in my own life, but what have you seen? Like, how do you correlate it to what they experienced and what we lead now, how we lead now?
The single biggest piece of disappointment for people who are in leadership today, especially if you're in authorized roles of leadership, right? So you're the CEO, you're the president, you're the executive director, is that you got here because you were an expert on the map, right? So what got you here won't take you there.